theological and philosophical claims are themselves the fault lines in evangelicalism. Turning to the present context, evangelicalism has become even more theologically and culturally diverse in the decades after the Chicago Statement and the revision of the ETS doctrinal statement. We cannot cover all the points of divergence, but mentioning a few might illustrate the point. Some evangelicals, for example, have moved away from the earlier commitment to propositional truth, while others believe it is the only coherent view. Some evangelicals have become open to the so-called theological interpretation of Scripture, while others defend traditional exegesis. Some evangelicals have accepted literary, form, and socio-cultural criticism of Scripture, while others maintain that only the grammatical historical method is appropriate. Finally, some evangelicals defend classical theism, while others prefer a more narratival approach to the doctrine of God. Each of these divergences have implicated the doctrine of inerrancy, and two of them have resulted in proceedings at the aforementioned Evangelical Theological Society. I have in mind here the trial of Robert Gundry and the trials of Clark Pinnock and John Sanders. In this context, some suggest that the theological diversity of evangelicalism would be solved if we only return to commitment to inerrancy. But from the point of view of the present project, the understanding of inerrancy has become complicated by the theological diversity. While there might not be as many different definitions of inerrancy as there are theologies within evangelicalism, certainly there is a growing pluralism. Our project hopes to help evangelicals move toward a more robust and unifying doctrine of inerrancy by calling attention to its deeper theological moorings. The first doctrine in this framework is, of course, the doctrine of God. Take one of the more recent flashpoints around inerrancy, which concern God's relationship to time. Some evangelicals have claimed that God has deliberately limited himself in relation to creation by forsaking his omniscience in order to engage in a dynamic and genuine relationship with creation. This self-imposed limitation of God's knowledge should limit our expectations of the inerrancy of Scripture. Desiring a fully inerrant text has more to do with our pride than with the humility of God, they say. Another major doctrine that influences our view of inerrancy is the doctrine of revelation. Among other things, the doctrine of revelation specifies the relationship among Scripture, reason, and tradition. How this relationship is coordinated will impact the scope of inerrancy. For example, if one believes that God reveals himself naturally as well as supernaturally, such that our natural reason is sufficient for knowledge of the physical as well as basic moral laws, then the revelation of God in Scripture might be limited to knowledge of God's plan of salvation. On this scheme, one might be led to the conclusion that Scripture is inerrant only in matters relating to salvation, but not in its description of, say, the natural world. The inspiration of Scripture has a similar impact on the doctrine of inerrancy. Historically, inerrancy has gone hand in hand with a theory of verbal plenary inspiration. However, this view is no longer common among evangelicals today. Those who have criticized it for undermining the humanness of Scripture's authors have argued for a stronger sense of God's accommodation to human situatedness and inspiration. The effect is similar to what we mentioned before with those who see God's knowledge as limited. This necessarily attenuated discussion of what is more fully developed in our project shows, first, that diversity in evangelicalism cannot be reduced to a mere matter of subscription to the doctrine of inerrancy. And second, that convictions about God, revelation, and inspiration are crucial for defining biblical inerrancy. Accordingly, we have asked the participants in this discussion to specify their understanding of these doctrines and how they shape their view of inerrancy. At the same time, we also asked them to explain their view of what might be called a meta-issue, the nature of truth. Some believe that the only form of truth is factuality. Others, however, think that while Scripture at places may not be factual, it is metaphysically or existentially true. If inerrancy is to be meaningful, we must be clear about what counts as truth and falsity. In addition to specifying their larger theological and epistemological tradition, we also asked our participants to assess the